Do you think you can tell fact from fear? One of these terrifying stories is true. Let's see if you're clever enough to guess which one it is. Story 1. The Broken Promise. I thought I was ready to marry James. He was everything I ever wanted: kind, thoughtful, handsome, and above all, he loved me in a way that made me feel safe. But as our wedding day approached, I started hearing stories. Whispers Whispers about his ex, Lily. Lily had passed away just months before they were supposed to get married. A tragic accident, they said. She was driving to meet him when her car skidded off the road in the rain, flipping over the guardrail. It was horrible, but James never talked about her. He said he was ready to move on. He loved me now. I wanted to believe him. I had to believe him. The day of the wedding came, and everything felt perfect. I stood in the back of the old church, my heart pounding with anticipation. The stained glass windows cast a soft glow, and the pews were filled with our friends and family. I clutched my bouquet, trying to calm my nerves, but something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. As I stepped into the aisle, I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore it, focusing on James, who was waiting for me at the altar. He looked perfect in his suit, his eyes shining with love. But as I walked closer, I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a woman standing in the shadows at the back of the church. She was wearing a white dress, her hair hanging in damp strands over her face. My heart stopped. I blinked, thinking I must be imagining things. But when I looked again, she was still there, watching. I froze. She wasn't one of the guests. I didn't recognize her at all. And then it hit me like a punch to the gut. This was Lily, his ex-girlfriend, the one who had died just before their wedding. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The lights flickered, plunging the church into darkness for a few seconds. When they came back on, she was gone. I stood there, my heart racing, my body frozen in place. No one else seemed to have noticed anything. The guests were still watching, waiting for me to finish my walk down the aisle. James was still smiling, oblivious to what I had seen. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, watching me, waiting for something. The ceremony continued, and I somehow made it through the vows. But all the while, I could feel her presence, that cold, suffocating feeling pressing in around me. When we finally kissed, sealing our marriage, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. That night, we went back to an old hotel, a charming, rustic place tucked away in the countryside. It was supposed to be romantic, the perfect end to a perfect day. But as soon as we walked into the room, the feeling of dread returned. The air was thick, the shadows too dark. I tried to ignore it, but the moment I lay down beside James, I felt it. Cold fingers brushing against my cheek. I shot up in bed, gasping. The room was silent, but I could feel her. He promised me, a voice whispered, soft and menacing. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was coming from the corner of the room, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I shook James awake, but he didn't stir. He was sleeping so deeply, as if nothing in the world could touch him. He promised me, the voice whispered again, louder this time. I tried to wake him again, shaking him harder, but he wouldn't budge. I was terrified, desperate to make it stop. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air too thick to breathe. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was barely rising, casting a soft glow over the room. I rolled over to reach for James, but my hand landed on cold, empty sheets. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. He was gone. I jumped out of bed, frantically looking around the room. His suitcase, his clothes, everything was still there, except him. All that was left was his wedding ring, sitting neatly on the nightstand beside the bed. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I grabbed the ring, my hands shaking. "James," I called, my voice cracking. But there was no answer. "He promised me." The voice came again, a low, haunting whisper filling the room. I turned, my heart in my throat, and there was Lily, standing in the doorway, her pale face twisted into a look of sorrow and fury. Her white dress was torn and stained, and her eyes were dark and hollow. I backed away, my legs trembling. "What do you want?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her cold, dead eyes boring into mine. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the terror that gripped my throat. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the lights flickered and she vanished. The room was empty again, but the silence was worse than her presence. James was gone, and I knew, deep down, he wasn't coming back. The hotel staff never found any trace of him. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. But I knew the truth. Lily had taken him. He had promised her, and now he was hers. Story 2. The Reflection. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had waited years for this moment, dreaming of it since I was a little girl, and now it was finally here. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, my ivory dress flowing around me like a cloud. The lace detail, the delicate beading, it was perfect. I was perfect. But as I looked at myself, something didn't feel right. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. I blinked, trying to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger. The woman in the mirror, she looked just like me, but there was something off about her. Her eyes, they were too dark, too hollow, and her smile, it was too wide, too sharp. I forced myself to look away. I was just nervous, that's all. Cold feet, jitters, everyone gets them. But as I turned to leave the room, I felt a tug, like something was pulling me back. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. My reflection hadn't moved. She was still facing the mirror, staring at me with those hollow eyes and that eerie smile. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. I took a step closer to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection followed, but it wasn't just mimicking my movements. She was anticipating them, as if she knew what I was going to do before I did it. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But she didn't answer. She just smiled wider, her eyes narrowing, as if she was amused by my fear. A knock on the door jolted me back to reality. It was my maid of honor, Sophie, asking if I was ready. I quickly turned away from the mirror, trying to steady my breathing. "I'll be right out," I called, my voice shaky. I didn't dare look back at the mirror as I left the room. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those dark eyes were still watching me, following me. The ceremony was a blur. I could barely focus on the vows, the music, the guests. All I could think about was that reflection, that thing in the mirror that wasn't me. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see her lurking somewhere in the shadows. But she never appeared. Not yet, anyway. It wasn't until the reception, when I was alone in the bathroom, that she came back. I was washing my hands, trying to calm myself down, when I saw her again in the mirror above the sink. This time, she wasn't smiling. Her face was twisted in anger, her eyes burning with something dark and violent. I froze, my heart racing. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging up the mirror. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, staring into those eyes that weren't mine, that hated me with a fury I couldn't understand. "What do you want?" I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and pressed it against the glass. To my horror, her hand began to push through, or at least I thought so. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, but I couldn't look away. "You took my place," she hissed, her voice echoing in my head. "This was supposed to be mine." "No," I gasped, shaking my head. I don't know you. I didn't take anything." But she didn't listen. Her hand broke through the mirror, followed by her arm and then her body. She stepped out of the glass like she was stepping through a doorway, her eyes locked on mine. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She was right in front of me now, her hand reaching for my throat. "This was supposed to be mine," she repeated, her voice low and menacing. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, but nothing happened. When I opened them again, she was gone. The bathroom was empty, the mirror was intact, and I was alone. I thought to myself, did this really happen? But I wasn't the same. I could feel it. Something had changed. I could still feel her presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to take what she believed was hers. And then it hit me. I wasn't looking at her reflection anymore. She was looking at mine. And in the mirror, I saw myself smile. But it wasn't my smile. It was hers. Story 3. The Lost Bride. It was a perfect day. The sun bathed the old manor in a golden glow, and the guests were all in high spirits, celebrating the union of Amelia and Henry. Amelia was radiant in her white gown, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall at midnight. She and Henry had met by chance, but it was the kind of love that seemed destined. Today, their love was to be sealed forever. As the reception wound down, someone suggested a game of hide and seek, a playful tradition among their friends. The manor was vast, with endless nooks and crannies, making it the perfect place for such a game. Laughing, Amelia volunteered to be the one to hide. With a mischievous grin, she slipped off into the house, the train of her dress trailing behind her like a whisper of silk. The game began, and the guests fanned out through the manor, searching for the bride. Henry led the search, calling out her name, his voice echoing through the empty halls. It wasn't long before everyone had been found, everyone except Amelia. At first, it was fun. Everyone expected her to be hiding in some clever spot, waiting to jump out and surprise them. But as the minutes turned into hours, concern began to replace the laughter. They searched every room, every closet, under every bed, but Amelia was nowhere to be found. Henry's heart began to pound with a cold dread. The game was over, but Amelia hadn't come out. They called out to her, their voices growing more desperate with each passing moment, but the manor remained silent, its walls seeming to close in around them. The hours turned into a sleepless night, and still no sign of Amelia. By morning, panic had set in. The guests searched the grounds, combing through the gardens, the woods, every inch of the property, but Amelia had vanished without a trace. Days passed, and the search expanded. The police were called, a missing persons report was filed, and Amelia's parents were devastated. They pleaded with the authorities, with the universe, for any sign of their daughter. But there was nothing. It was as if she had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the memory of her laughter and the echo of her steps in the manor. Henry was inconsolable. He refused to leave the manor, hoping against hope that she would return. He retraced every step they had taken together, every corner she could have hidden in, but it was all in vain. The love of his life was gone, and no one could explain why. Weeks turned into months, and the once lively manor became a tomb of grief and unanswered questions. The guests eventually returned to their lives. The search faded, and the world moved on. But Henry couldn't. He lingered in the house, haunted by the memories of that day, of the love that was supposed to be forever. Eventually, Henry had no choice but to move on with his life, though a piece of him was lost forever. He left the manor, unable to bear the weight of its empty halls. The house stood abandoned for years, a relic of a happiness that had turned to sorrow. Decades later, the manor was sold to a new family. They decided to renovate it, hoping to breathe new life into the old walls. During the renovation, the workers found their way into the attic, a dusty, forgotten place filled with old furniture and trunks. As they cleared out the clutter, they stumbled upon a large, ornate chest. It was locked, the metal rusted with age, but something about it seemed off. Curiosity piqued. They forced it open. Inside, they found a sight that would haunt them forever. A skeleton, curled up in a fetal position, still clad in the remnants of a white wedding dress. The bones were fragile, the veil draped over the skull like a shroud. This was Amelia, the bride who had disappeared all those years ago. The chest must have closed and locked when she climbed inside, trapping her in a dark, airless tomb. She had been there the whole time, just out of reach, suffocating to death while her friends and family searched in vain. The manor was never the same after that. The new owners couldn't bear to stay, and the house was left to crumble, a monument to a tragic love story that ended too soon. And so, Amelia became a ghost, not just in the house, but in the hearts of those who loved her, a bride lost forever in a game that was never meant to end.